Ukrainian forces continue their counterattacks against the Russian penetration of their lines north of Pokrovsk, while the US president does not rule out US peacekeepers in Ukraine. We'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this sitrep about the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians managed to hit the Azot chemical factory in Stavropol. At least 9 explosions were reported and a fire has broken out. They also hit the railway yard in Liski. This is up here. Here the railway logistics was struck. The Ukrainians also hit a Transneft oil depot. As we can see, FIRMS, the satellite system that shows fires, has confirmed that a fire has broken out in that oil depot. We switch to the developments along the front line, and here we have the Ukrainians advancing according to Russian observers. This geolocation shows the Ukrainians here between Novomykolaiivka and Yablunivka. This is here on the map. We have to say, though, that, no, I think it was here. This is being considered to be under Ukrainian control by the deep state map for quite a while, though. So whether that is a fresh advance by the Ukrainians that was not confirmed otherwise yet is unclear. As we can see, the pro-Russian Krymy Caprice says this is now freshly recaptured by the Ukrainians. At least we have visual evidence of the Ukrainians there now and can thus confirm the deep state map. That's it from Sumy. We switch to the Kharkiv region and it's the same there as usual. So fighting being reported, small infantry groups attacking, but no change along the front line. We switch to the Eastern Front, and here in the Kupiansk region, a Ukrainian officer is saying that the Russians are getting more active. A Ukrainian military spokesperson is also saying that the Russians use civilian clothing for attacks. This is obviously intending to make attacks on soldiers that are advancing less likely. If they wear civilian clothing, then, for instance, FPV drones might not strike them, as the Ukrainians do not want to hit their compatriots. This is perfidy and thus a war crime forbidden by the Geneva Convention. It also means that once again, doing something like this will create additional civilian victims, as the Ukrainian side thus will be more likely to strike civilians out of mistake, as they, after events like this, will consider civilian clothing to be a potential enemy. And this is one of the side effects of this Russian perfidy. This will very likely create additional civilian victims, and that's one of the reasons why this is a war crime. We switch, that's it already though, with territorial changes along the Eastern Front north of the river Seversky Donetsk. South of it, we have the Russians concentrating forces, according to Ukrainian officers. They are concentrating forces at the Liss Shansk refinery. This was, the refinery is, I think, somewhere here. So they are concentrating forces there, and thus will expect, the Ukrainians expect a bigger attack by the Russians in the near future. Further south, we have Ukrainian positions confirmed in the Konstantinivka region, and that's interesting because we have the Ukrainians in the fortified area here where the Russians recently have operated. This is this area up here. Here we have Ukrainian presence confirmed that they are in these fortifications, and we have the Russians shelling the mine north of Pokrovsk. This is this here, with multiple launch rocket systems. So the mine is probably fully under Ukrainian control, unless of course the Russians did danger close firing here. But this would be an indication that the Ukrainians control the lines of communication into the Shcherbinivka and Katerinivka area, and thus one of the explanations while this is not evacuated yet. That's it from the Konstantinivka area. We switch to Pokrovsk, and here we have the Russians east of Kucherev Yar. We have a geolocation of this at this point here. So this is directly east of Kucherev Yar up to this point here. Here are the Russians. Then we have the Russians inside of Kucherov Yar also being confirmed. So visual evidence that they are inside of Kucherov Yar as well. Then we have geolocations of the Ukrainians to the west of Soloti Kolodes here. This is already marked as back under Ukrainian control by the deep state map, but now slowly the geolocations are popping up. And by the way, obviously confirming that the deep state map was correct in this area. So we have Ukrainian presence in here confirmed. We have visual evidence, though, that in the same region here, west of Soloti Kolodies, in the western part of it, Russian positions have been shelled with Ukrainian artillery, indicating that they recently were there at least. And then we have the Ukrainians inside of the town itself, inside of Soloti Kolodes. This would mean that either the Russians west of it are now encircled, as the Ukrainians are operating to the west and to the east of it, or that this area is already cleared and the shelling was preceding an infantry attack here and that the area is taken. So whether or not all of Soloti Kolodes is back under Ukrainian control cannot be confirmed, but if the Russians are in the western part of it, then they are definitely in big trouble. Further south, we have the Russians close to Novoekonomichne. This is up here. We have the geolocation of the Russians here at the southeastern tip of the reservoir. Another indication, recently we had the Russians here, so they are getting closer to Mirnograd from various directions. Then we have the Russians in Udachne, again a fresh position inside of the previous contested area. Whether they managed to gain a foothold and actually shift the permanent positions further north is unclear, but Udachne is of high importance for the Ukrainians, as it is the last built-up area before the last a real usable line of supply into Pokrovsk. Even that one is already under threat by FPV drones. That's it from this region, and we have something from the Dnipro region here in Iskra, or as Google calls it, Andrivka Klevtsove. We have the Ukrainians raising flags in the southern part and in the eastern part, indicating that they're fully back under control. In the last sitrep, I showed you this area to be likely captured by the Russians. It seems the Ukrainians are back in the area. Overall, that's already it with territorial changes. We have reports by the GUR that they hit a military convoy of the Russians close to Rilsk in Kursk. Lieutenant General Abrachev, the deputy commander of the Sever group, has been heavily injured. He had an arm and a leg amputated, according to the reports, and this is slowly being confirmed by Russian mill bloggers. Overall, the strategic situation is unchanged. The Russians hold the initiative, but we have some Ukrainian successes. The Ukrainians are still working in eliminating that Russian advance, that Russian break into their lines north of Pokrovsk. They clearly have not fully achieved this yet, but the operations are continuing there, and as the Russian positions are threatened at the flanks as well, some further success is to be expected here. Then that's it with the situation here. We have further informations from the south, from Melitopol. Here the GUR is reporting that they blew up an ammunition dump in Melitopol. Several Russian soldiers were killed. Others reported that was partisans, but with the GUR claiming it might have been their agents, or the partisans might have done it in coordination. In troop generation, we have something really interesting. The Ukrainians have shown a new cruise missile. And that cruise missile has a range of 3,000 kilometers and a warhead of 1 ton. So that let's make it clear. If this thing is being produced in sufficient number, this will be an actual game changer. Now, we've talked about a lot of game changers in the past, things that could have done something but didn't. Game changers were usually proclaimed by others. That 50 Leopard 2s will change the war overall was nobody's analysis, was not the analysis of any serious observer here. But with this, if the Ukrainians manage to produce it in sufficient numbers. And that's obviously the all-decisive caveat. But if the Ukrainians produce this in numbers that make a difference, then they can destroy significant parts of the Russian defense industry. For instance, Uralvagonzavod, where the T-90M is being produced, would be in range of this. And with a 1-ton warhead, that's a whole different ballpark than the drones they are using right now. So this would be a warhead that can actually destroy factories if factories are being hit several times. So we'll have to obviously see if the Ukrainians manage to produce this in bigger numbers. But this picture was also published here by Associated Press. And as we can see, there's already a second one behind it. So in the end, we'll have to see how many of those the Ukrainians are able to produce, because that's the big question. One of them every 4 months won't change anything. So this will be the all-decisive question, but this weapon has the potential to change a lot inside of the conflict. Now let's switch to the political part. Marco Rubio said a deal where only one side is giving in is not a deal, but a capitulation in regards to potential negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And he said the US want that Ukraine can rebuild and will never again face a Russian invasion. That's obviously important because that acknowledges that Ukraine needs securities in regards to potential further Russian aggression. Then we have here CNN writing that according to Witkov, Russia supposedly accepts Article 5 security guarantee, a security guarantee that is comparable with Article 5. Now, that sounds obviously impressive because Article 5 is the article in the NATO Charter that would give aid to NATO nations being attacked. But we have to look at the fine print. Article 5 requires unanimous vote. Russia already announced and offered something similar in the spring of 2022. So the first 2 months after the full-scale invasion, they offered security guarantees for the Ukrainians, but Russia would have been one of the guarantors. And to come to aid of Ukraine, all of the guarantors would have to sign off on it. So Russia would have had to vote against itself once it invades Ukraine again, and thus obviously making sure that Ukraine's aid will be blocked by Russia if Russia sees fit. So if an Article 5, anything comparable with Article 5 is being offered for Ukraine, but there are guarantors that are not willing to fight against Russia, if they are guarantors that are not likely to sign off on it. Not even fighting is the main matter, but if some of them are likely not to sign off on a need to aid Ukraine, then this Article 5, whatever shape it has, is completely pointless. So in these security guarantees, there can only be nations that have credibility in actually aiding Ukraine in the fight, in a potential future fight against Russia. This is still ignoring that an Article 5 does not explicitly demand military aid, but that's a different question. And we have to say it's already questionable with the US under the current government, whether or not they want to fight Russia in regards to a potential security guarantee. That would already be questionable. But if Russia is part of such an agreement, it's pointless. Also, China would not be willing to fight Russia for Ukraine. That should be obvious and self-explanatory. So Russia wouldn't even have to be inside of such security guarantees. It would be absolutely sufficient for China to be part of it, and that would already make sure that the guarantee would not start if Russia renews its aggression against Ukraine. Russia is also demanding that Russian is being reintroduced as an official language inside of Ukraine for a government and as a national language, and they want full liberty to operate for the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, this has to be understood. The Russian Orthodox Church is controlled by the Russian government. Its head, Kirill, is a former KGB agent. So this is not a regular church. This is not an independent entity that got voted where the current head of the church became it by being the most devout and being elected by his peers. This is an institution that coordinates itself with the Russian government. And just to illustrate this head of the Russian Orthodox Church has basically announced a holy war. He said if somebody dies in this war, he's going to heaven. and this is an absolute scandal in historic proportions, because when the Orthodox Church was still having its main seat inside of Constantinople, there the patriarchs were refusing to say that, even when it meant the survival of Eastern Rome, of Byzantium. The Byzantine emperor for centuries was asking the patriarchs to please issue something similar to the orders of the Crusade for the Western religion, for the Western Christianity, to give the Orthodox faithful a direct path to heaven if they fight and die against the disbelievers, against the infidels, and the Orthodoxy refused it, as they said there is no basis for this in the religious text and in our religion. Now Kirill has done that. This has to be understood, how closely the Moscow Church is connected with the Russian government. Trump also talked to Zelensky, and he said that Putin is emphasizing that his troops are having huge successes inside of Ukraine along the front line, and that he can basically take whatever he wants. He's thus demanding handover of Donetsk and Luhansk, and is offering in return to freeze the front line at other parts of the front line. This would mean that a Ukrainian withdrawal would be required. Putin would in return also say that he is not aiming to conquer anything else, and he offers that there would be legal code, so basically a law that would prevent Russia from invading Ukraine again, or other states. But obviously we've seen that something like this is not really needed for the Russians, as there are other ways around it. But for a Ukrainian withdrawal, that would be an absolute insanity for the Ukrainians right now without security. So at the very least, an observed and protected ceasefire, better with foreign security guarantees, even if Ukraine agrees to withdraw from Donetsk. And Ukraine would have to delay that for many months to first allow a full evacuation without problems, not only from the military perspective, but also from the civilians. And at the same time, the Ukrainians would need time to build up fortifications behind the Oblast Donetsk, which then would be the front line in a potential renewed fighting, as their fortifications are mostly inside of Donetsk, and they would thus lose them and sit in the open ground and could be run over by the Russians. The area behind the fortress the fortress belt here, this here, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Rushkivka and Konstantinivka. So the area behind this is offering far less opportunities for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Thus, if they are forced to withdraw from that, they would need time to build up fortifications to make up for that. And even that would not be equivalent, as obviously Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Rushkivka are big cities that offer a huge protection. Otherwise, the Russians might just steamroll them, and no promises whatever are going to be helping with this. No promises not to do an additional invasion, as Putin in the past has just broken laws and the constitution whenever he felt like it. And obviously this would also not be an additional invasion, but it would just be once more the defending of those that speak Russian or something like this. Like in the end, if a law requires something, but you have control over the Supreme Court, then you just interpret it the way you want it and you do whatever you want. Also, there's defense industry in those cities, which would be lost to the Russians if there's not the time to evacuate it, which would require taking the machines apart, and which would take months and many months. For instance, in Kramatorsk, there's the old Kramatorsk machine building plant. It is producing tank guns, and the Kramatorsk heavy-duty machine tool building plant is producing barrels and artillery pieces for tanks and artillery, so the barrels. There, in that Kramatorsk facility, the Bogdana was developed, and very likely pieces of the Bogdana are still being produced inside of this. In Sloviansk, there's the chemical factory Slovashmash, I think. it is probably involved in producing of ammunition right now. And there's Betonmash and the Slovianska tool factory that are likely also being involved in the production of defense material right now, as they are able to produce big metal pieces, and that's in times of war a prime candidate to retool for weapons production. In Družkivka, there were several factories for tools and material for mining. Again, heavy metal material that can be changed to defense industry. In those last two cases, I do not have proof that they are producing weapons or weapon parts, but it's obviously highly likely. The capture of the fortress belt itself would likely take years. Even capturing it in 2026 seems somewhat unrealistic for the Russians. So giving that up would be a big hit to the Ukrainian defensive ability, but at the same time, all of this shows how important the Ukrainian counteroffensive in summer 2022 was, the Balaklia offensive. Without it, the Russians would have done a similar thing as they did in the other four oblasts, a faked referendum, and they would lay claim to Kharkiv now as well. Trump previously said, and that's interesting too, he said that Zelensky could stop the war right away. He could actually, according to Orwell, because George Orwell said the fastest way to end a war is to lose it. So obviously Ukraine can capitulate in the next 5 minutes. This was obviously questionable, and interesting too that he also mentions once again that there was no fighting about the Crimean Peninsula. Zelensky himself addressed this. He also said it was a mistake not to fight for the Crimean Peninsula. This is actually an event why we see, for instance, the Philippines still continuing to challenge the Chinese aggressions at the Scarborough Shoal, because if you give up fighting for something, you lose a part of the claim you have to a certain area. Just check the Åland Islands between Sweden and Finland, majority Swedish speaking or purely Swedish speaking, and still today a part of Finland. Why? Because Sweden refused to fight for it. So fighting for an area, even if the fight is pointless, is actually a necessity to reinforce a claim to it. As absurd as it sounds, that fighting, even if there's no point in it, even if a defeat is certain, is a necessary part to lay claims. Now let's talk about the meeting between Trump and Putin. I waited to do this video until I had time for the press conference. Now it started very well. It is an honor having the president of Ukraine with us, he said. Now that's obviously, starting off with this to the public is showing a sign. He said that a long-term peace is the goal, not just for 2 years. There was no answer to the first question whether US peacekeepers are going to be in Ukraine. And then when a second journalist asked, he said, we will let you know later. We will be involved. The Europeans, are the first line of defense. So he is not ruling out US peacekeepers. He is saying that the Europeans are going to be supported and the Europeans will be on the front lines. But even in 2 questions, he did not rule out US peacekeepers. When it comes to Article 5, he was asked as well. Trump didn't say any details, but is not saying that it's not going to happen. This is also important. And he said, we are going to give them good protection. So I guess some good news among all the bad ones. We'll have to see in the end what comes out of the meeting that is currently happening with the Western leaders. But that's it for today's sitrep. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.